They said Africa could never stand on its own. But tonight, from the heart of West Africa, a new story is being written, one carved not in ink, but in gold. Burkina Faso, a small, landlocked nation once dismissed as one of the poorest on earth, is proving the world wrong. Under the leadership of a young soldier, Captain Ibrahim Traoré, this country has done the unthinkable. It expelled French troops, took back control of its gold mines, and started rebuilding its future with its own hands. No foreign aid, no strings attached, just courage and conviction. When Traoré made that move in 2023, the Western world trembled. Because for the first time in decades, an African nation refused to be managed, lectured, or owned. Western media rushed to label him a dictator. But on the streets of Ouagadougou, mothers began to smile again. Teachers received their salaries on time, soldiers came home with pride. And the people of Burkina Faso started to believe that independence wasn't a dream, it was a decision. For generations, we were told that progress required permission from Paris, from Washington, from the IMF. But what if true independence comes from saying no to exploitation, no to dependency, no to the illusion of democracy packaged in foreign control? As gold flows not to French banks, but into the hands of Burkinabe citizens, the world is beginning to ask, what if this is Africa's turning point? What if this is the moment history begins to reverse and Africa starts to write its own chapters again? So tonight we dive deep into the story of how Burkina Faso turned defiance into destiny. Please share if you believe that real freedom begins when nations reclaim their voice. Subscribe if you stand with President Ibrahim Traoré and those who dare to say no more. It all began in late 2022 when Captain Ibrahim Traoré, then only 34 years old, took control of a nation that had been quietly bleeding for decades. The world barely noticed, but for the people of Burkina Faso, it was as if the chains around their homeland had finally begun to crack. For generations, France had its hand deep in Burkina's soil. The country's gold, its most precious resource, flowed out in endless convoys to Europe. Multinational corporations signed contracts that gave them up to 90% of the profits, leaving the Burkinabe people with little more than dust and debt. Western aid agencies pretended to help, but in truth they were the middlemen in a game of plunder, sending gold one way and debt the other. That cycle ended when Traoré arrived. Within months, he nationalized key gold mines, tore up the contracts that robbed his country blind, and redirected the profits back to the people. He expelled French troops, closed foreign military bases, and banned the so-called NGOs that were acting as intelligence fronts. The result: for the first time in modern history, Burkina Faso began to breathe economically. Government officials announced that the country had earned over $18 billion from its gold sector since 2022, money that once disappeared into foreign vaults now stayed home. And the change wasn't just on paper. Salaries for teachers and soldiers were raised. Schools that had been abandoned for years reopened. Farmers received new grain storage facilities to combat hunger. Roads were repaired using domestic funds, not French development loans. The transformation was real, tangible, and visible in the faces of everyday citizens. But while the Burkinabe were celebrating, Paris was panicking. French media accused Traoré of undermining democracy. International analysts warned that he was isolating his country. Yet to the African continent, he looked like something entirely different, a symbol of resistance, a living echo of Thomas Sankara, the revolutionary leader assassinated in 1987 after daring to dream of a self-reliant Africa. Traoré's government then went one step further. Alongside Mali and Niger, Burkina Faso formed the Alliance of Sahel States, a regional defense pact designed to protect African interests without Western oversight. Together, these nations declared they would defend one another against any external interference. For the first time in modern African history, sovereignty had a backbone, and as the alliance grew stronger, something remarkable happened. The narrative began to flip. Western outlets that had called Burkina Faso unstable suddenly had to explain why its currency was stabilizing, why its citizens were working, and why the country's GDP was rising despite international sanctions. This was the new reality, one forged not through aid, but through ownership. Every gold bar shipped from the mines of Houndé Taparco and Essakane carried a message carved in silence: Africa can survive on its own. Still, the battle wasn't just economic, it was psychological. The most powerful act Traoré performed wasn't the expulsion of troops or the nationalization of gold. It was the restoration of dignity. For decades, Africans were told they were too poor, too divided, too dependent to rule themselves. But now a small country once dismissed as Upper Volta was teaching the world that true wealth begins in the mind. By reclaiming its gold, Burkina Faso had reclaimed its confidence, and that was more threatening to the old powers than any weapon or war. Because once one nation breaks free, others start to follow. The real storm began not in Ouagadougou, but in Paris. The day the news broke that Burkina Faso had earned over $18 billion from its gold mines without a single French company involved, the shockwaves rattled through Europe's financial centers. Editorials in Le Monde and Reuters called it unsustainable. Analysts at the IMF called it a populist illusion. Yet deep down, the West knew the truth. A new economic order was forming, and they were no longer in control. Western diplomats tried to disguise their panic behind polite language concerns over governance, lack of transparency, authoritarian tendencies. But on the ground, what they truly feared was simple: Africa was learning to win without them. Burkina Faso's people could see the double standard. When French companies siphoned gold for decades, no one called that dictatorship. But when an African leader used that same gold to feed his people suddenly, it became a threat to democracy. This hypocrisy only fueled the movement. Crowds began to fill the streets, not in protest but in celebration, waving the red and green flag, chanting Traore le peuple avec toi Traore, the people are with you. Market women, teachers, and soldiers stood side by side, united by something they hadn't felt in years: ownership of their destiny. At the height of the tension, Traore delivered a message that echoed across the continent. They will call us names, but we will build our nation with our own hands, because no one respects a slave who still begs his master for bread. Those words became the defining line of the revolution. In response, Western media unleashed a new wave of propaganda. French networks aired documentaries depicting Traoré as a military strongman. Think tanks in Washington warned of Russian influence. Aid agencies suspended their operations, claiming unsafe conditions. But the irony was unmistakable. It was safer in Burkina Faso now than it had been in years. Then came the turning point, the formation of the Alliance of Sahel States (AL). When Traoré joined hands with Colonel Assimi Goïta of Mali and General Abdourahmane Tiani of Niger, the world realized this was not just a national uprising, it was regional defiance. Together they announced a shared vision: one defense, one command, one goal: African security for African people. The announcement was met with fury in European capitals. France recalled ambassadors. The EU threatened sanctions. But across Africa, the air shifted. From Dakar to Kinshasa, the question was whispered: if Burkina can do it, why can't we? The climax came in a single phrase Traoré used during a rally in 2024. They thought they could bury us, but we are seeds. That moment turned him from a national leader into a continental symbol. The Western press mocked his uniform and beret, but millions of Africans saw something deeper: the rebirth of Thomas Sankara's dream, the same fire they tried to extinguish in 1987. As the Western narrative crumbled, the new African narrative began to bloom. Musicians composed songs for Traoré. Students painted murals of him beside Sankara. Even in Madagascar and Ghana, people began to call for similar reforms. Meanwhile, France's own economy began to shake. Its gold reserves, long supported by African extraction, started to dwindle. The Banque de France's quarterly reports quietly revealed deficits. For the first time, the colonizer was losing sleep. In Washington, policymakers debated whether to criticize or stay silent. The State Department opted for strategic caution, because in truth, condemning Burkina Faso risked igniting something much larger, an awakening that could sweep across the entire continent. Burkina Faso had done what few believed possible. It broke the myth that Africa's survival depended on its oppressors. It proved that sovereignty isn't given, it's seized. And now the rest of the world watched nervously as one question began to echo louder and louder across the Sahel: who's next? When the dust settled after the gold revolution, what emerged in Burkina Faso wasn't chaos, it was reconstruction. But not the kind funded by the IMF or managed by foreign consultants. This was a grassroots rebirth built by the hands of teachers, soldiers, and farmers who finally saw their work reflected in the country's progress. Across Ouagadougou, the capital once crowded by foreign NGOs, new construction sites began to rise. Roads were being paved using domestic funds. Local engineers, not foreign contractors, led the projects. Farmers received new grain silos and irrigation systems built with Burkinabe steel. The gold that once filled European banks now filled the veins of a new economy. For decades, the word aid in Africa meant dependency. Now it meant self-investment. Schools reopened with locally made desks. Hospitals began operating on renewable power grids installed by Burkina Faso technicians. Even the National Broadcasting Service started airing lessons on financial literacy and sovereignty, teaching citizens how their own resources were transforming their lives. The most visible change, however, wasn't economic, it was psychological. A sense of pride swept across the nation. Young men and women who once dreamed of fleeing to Europe began to see purpose in staying home. The flag, once a symbol of survival, had become a symbol of victory. Burkina Faso, the land of upright people, was finally living up to its name. President Ibrahim Traoré made a simple yet revolutionary declaration: "We will not be ashamed of who we are. Our wealth will no longer wear another nation's flag." That message reshaped the national identity. Artists began to celebrate African aesthetics, dressing in local fabrics and singing in traditional languages. Teachers rewrote history books to include African heroes erased by colonial narratives. Even government offices replaced French mottos with local proverbs that spoke of resilience and honor. But with independence came new challenges. Burkina Faso's move away from Western oversight made it a target for covert campaigns. Some NGOs pulled out, claiming safety concerns. Western media circulated stories of censorship and oppression. Yet within the country, the people themselves said otherwise. A retired teacher in Bobo Dioulasso said it best during a local interview: "We are freer in our silence than we ever were in their noise." That quiet defiance resonated. It wasn't just about gold or politics, it was about restoring dignity. When a government pays its soldiers with national gold instead of foreign debt, the salute of a soldier becomes a salute to the people. When a mother sees her child in a newly painted classroom, she understands the true meaning of independence, not slogans, but sustenance. Politically, Traoré's reforms shook the entire African landscape. The Alliance of Sahel States, AES, grew into more than a defense pact, it became a moral front. Other African nations began revisiting colonial-era contracts, demanding fair shares for their oil, copper, and uranium. Even nations that once doubted Burkina's approach began to send delegations to learn from it. In the process, Burkina Faso inspired a new vocabulary. Words like economic sovereignty, collective dignity, and post-aid governance entered Africa's political lexicon. But every revolution carries a cost. France froze some of Burkina Faso's foreign assets. Western investors withdrew capital. And yet, despite these pressures, the country did not collapse, it adapted. Citizens organized local cooperatives, barter systems, and savings circles. Instead of fear, there was determination. Burkina Faso had replaced foreign dependency with domestic solidarity. In the eyes of the world, it was a political gamble. But to the Burkina Faso people, it was simply justice long overdue and finally theirs. From Washington to Brussels, policymakers have been watching Burkina Faso's transformation with quiet disbelief and quiet fear. Officially, the United States has taken what it calls a neutral stance. No harsh sanctions, no public condemnation, just strategic silence. But behind closed doors, think tanks and intelligence briefings are full of uneasy questions. What happens if more African nations follow Traoré's lead? What happens if Western influence, once guaranteed by aid, suddenly becomes irrelevant? For decades, Africa was viewed through a narrow lens as a continent of potential forever waiting for foreign guidance. But Burkina Faso has broken that narrative. It has shown that political stability can emerge not from compliance, but from courage. That prosperity can grow not from the World Bank's balance sheets, but from the soil itself. And so the silence from Washington is not indifference, it's calculation. American officials understand that public opposition to Traoré could backfire, making him a hero to the entire global South. The world is changing too fast, and the old colonial vocabulary no longer fits the new reality. In Europe, however, the tone is different. Paris feels humiliated. French television channels once described Burkina Faso as the model pupil of Francophone democracy. Now they call it a rogue state. The loss of military bases, mining contracts, and influence in the Sahel has left France scrambling to find relevance in a region it once ruled with impunity. The European Union, too, worries about what it calls the contagion effect. Mali, Niger, Guinea, and even Ghana are beginning to talk openly about resource sovereignty. Behind closed doors in Brussels, diplomats whisper about a second decolonization wave, a wave they can neither stop nor fully understand. Meanwhile, in the halls of Moscow and Beijing, there's applause not because they control Burkina Faso, but because they see a shifting global balance. Russia offers training and security aid. China proposes infrastructure partnerships. Neither comes without cost, but the symbolism is powerful. Africa finally has choices again. And beyond geopolitics, something deeper is stirring, especially among the African diaspora in America. Black Americans, Caribbean communities, and Pan-African groups are rediscovering a pride long buried beneath centuries of distortion. They see in Ibrahim Traoré a reflection of the leaders their own ancestors were denied, bold, unapologetic, and unbought. In universities across the U.S., students now discuss the Traoré doctrine in forums about post-colonial governance. Activists quote his speeches beside those of Malcolm X and Thomas Sankara. For the first time in a long time, Africa is not the subject of pity, it's the subject of admiration. And yet the global establishment remains uneasy. Western media still calls Traoré a populist. Analysts predict collapse within a year. But 2 years have passed, and Burkina Faso stands taller than before, proof that independence once reclaimed is not easily undone. Perhaps that's the real lesson for the world. Power built on exploitation may last for centuries, but power built on dignity can outlive them all. And somewhere in Washington, someone is surely asking the question that echoes across Africa today: if Burkina Faso can do it, who's next? The world often forgets that revolutions don't always come with gunfire. Sometimes they come quietly through the hum of machines building new roads, the sound of miners working for themselves, or the laughter of children returning to school after years of neglect. That is what's happening in Burkina Faso today. It isn't just political change, it's a moral correction. A country once written off as too poor to lead is teaching the world that freedom is not granted through treaties, loans, or lectures. It's earned through sacrifice, conviction, and faith in one's people. But history warns us that every act of independence invites retaliation. Already whispers of sabotage circulate. Western intelligence networks, disinformation campaigns, and economic blockades, the same old tools of control, are quietly returning under new names. Human rights reports, development partnerships, strategic cooperation. The same hands that once looted Africa's gold now extend in the name of democracy. This is the new frontier of colonialism, not in chains or armies, but in contracts and narratives. And that is why what's happening in Burkina Faso matters far beyond its borders. Because if one African nation can break free from centuries of dependency, it exposes the lie that the rest of the continent cannot. From the Sahel to the Caribbean, from the Americas to the islands of the Indian Ocean, a question now lingers like a slow dawn. What if independence was never truly over? What if the second liberation of Africa is happening right now, not through bloodshed, but through ownership, through truth, through courage? President Ibrahim Traoré has said, "We are not against the world. We are against being owned by it." That single line carries the weight of an entire generation's struggle. It is not anti-Western. It is profoundly human, a reminder that dignity is the one currency no empire can print. So as the dust of a new Africa rises, the world must decide: will it watch with fear or listen with humility? Will it cling to control or accept a future built on equality? The story of Burkina Faso isn't just about gold or politics. It's about the rebirth of pride, the quiet revolution of a people who chose to stand up instead of bow down. Please share this story if you believe that real independence begins with self-respect. Subscribe if you stand with truth, sovereignty, and President Ibrahim Traoré's vision for a free Africa. Because the future isn't waiting in Paris or Washington. It's already being written in the red dust of Ouagadougou.